Russian forces are collapsing along a critical stretch of the Ukrainian front line in a secret withdrawal as we speak. Not metaphorically, literally. Under the cover of darkness, entire Russian battalions are abandoning positions they swore would hold for months. Tanks sit silent with engines cold, artillery pieces are spiked and left behind, fuel depots burn unchecked, and command posts are empty except for the scattered maps and half-eaten rations of men who fled in panic. Ukrainian reconnaissance units are already moving into the vacuum, seizing ground that Moscow declared untouchable just weeks ago. This is not a planned repositioning. This is the brutal truth Putin is desperately trying to hide. His vaunted front line is cracking wide open because the doctrinal house of cards he built on outdated assumptions has finally collapsed under the weight of Ukrainian adaptation. Let that sink in for a moment. What you are witnessing is not some isolated tactical adjustment. This secret withdrawal is the latest, most damning case study in why Russian military assumptions were always going to fail against a Ukrainian force that learns, adapts, and strikes faster than Moscow can react. The real question is not whether this collapse happened. The real question is how many more sectors will follow before the entire Russian position in the east becomes untenable. And what happens next changes everything. Pull the lens back. For months, Russian command poured concrete, mines, and manpower into what they called layered defensive belts. They believed their Soviet-era doctrine would work again, massed artillery to pulverize any approach, electronic warfare to blind Ukrainian drones, and sheer numbers to absorb losses that would break any Western army. They told themselves Ukraine lacked the reserves, the technology, and the will to breach those lines. They bet the farm on static defense and the assumption that time was on their side. Those assumptions are now burning alongside their abandoned equipment. The hidden military variable here is simple but devastating. Ukrainian forces have mastered the integration of real-time drone reconnaissance, precision fires, and small unit maneuver in a way that renders Russian depth meaningless. While Moscow still operates as if this is a war of attrition fought with 1980s tactics, Ukraine treats every sector as a dynamic chessboard where information dominance decides the outcome before the first tank even moves. That asymmetry was always going to produce exactly this result. Now, let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because the mainstream coverage is still framing this as minor Russian adjustments. Nothing could be further from the truth. This withdrawal did not begin yesterday. It is the culmination of weeks of escalating pressure that exposed every flaw in the Russian system. It started with Ukrainian probing operations across a 40-kilometer front in the Donetsk sector. Small teams supported by FPV drone swarms began testing the outer minefields and observation posts. Russian forces responded exactly as their doctrine dictated, heavy artillery barrages and calls for reinforcements. But here's where the first doctrinal failure became visible. Ukrainian electronic warfare teams had already mapped the Russian frequencies. They jammed the counter-battery radars while their own HIMARS and domestic systems delivered precision strikes on the very artillery batteries doing the firing. In one 48-hour period alone, Ukrainian forces destroyed 27 Russian self-propelled guns and 3 command nodes without ever exposing a single major ground unit to direct fire. That set the stage. Russian commanders, still clinging to the belief that volume of fire would compensate for poor targeting, doubled down. They moved reserves forward, approximately 1,200 troops and 40 armored vehicles into what they thought was a secure rear area. Ukrainian drone operators, operating in relays of 50 to 60 FPVs per night, turned that movement into a shooting gallery. One after another, the lead vehicles were immobilized by cheap drones carrying shaped charges. The rest of the column bunched up exactly as Russian training had taught them to do in convoy security. Within hours, Ukrainian artillery finished the job. By the time the sun rose, 19 tanks and 31 armored personnel carriers sat destroyed or abandoned in a kill zone less than 2 kilometers long. And it gets even more serious from here. As Ukrainian forces consolidated their gains, they shifted to systematic targeting of Russian logistics. Supply routes that Russian planners had labeled protected by terrain and distance became exposed. Night after night, Ukrainian long-range strike teams hit fuel depots, ammunition caches, and repair workshops. We are talking about losses that Russian industry simply cannot replace at the current rate of production. One particularly devastating strike took out a forward ammunition depot holding an estimated 800 tons of 152 millimeter shells, enough to sustain heavy defensive fire for nearly a week. That single blow forced Russian batteries across the entire sector to ration rounds, creating gaps that Ukrainian infantry exploited with devastating effect. Pull the lens back again to the larger pattern. This is not random attrition. This is the predictable outcome of two fundamentally different military cultures colliding. Russian doctrine still emphasizes mass and centralized control. Ukrainian doctrine, forged in the brutal laboratory of this war, emphasizes decentralization, speed, and the relentless exploitation of every Russian mistake. Where Russian units wait for orders from higher headquarters that are often hours or days behind the reality on the ground, Ukrainian platoon leaders make decisions in real time based on live drone feeds. That asymmetry in decision-making cycles is lethal. By day 12 of the intensified operation, the cumulative pressure became unsustainable. Russian forward positions began reporting that their electronic warfare systems, once considered a trump card, were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Ukrainian drone traffic. Low-cost FPVs operating in coordinated waves of 80 to 100 at a time saturated the jammers. Some got through. Others forced the Russian operators to divert power and attention, creating windows for more sophisticated strikes. The result was chaos in the Russian chain of command. Unit after unit began requesting permission to withdraw. Higher headquarters, terrified of admitting failure to Moscow, delayed approval. That hesitation cost them dearly. Ukrainian forces, sensing the paralysis, launched a coordinated night assault across 3 axes. By morning, Russian lines had been breached in 2 places, and the secret withdrawal orders finally came, too late to save the heavy equipment. The industrial and state-level consequences of this collapse are already rippling outward. Russia entered this phase of the war with a manpower pool stretched to the breaking point. Every soldier lost in this sector must be replaced by either fresh conscripts with minimal training or by pulling units from other already vulnerable fronts. Neither option is sustainable. The Russian defense industry, despite massive state spending, cannot produce armored vehicles fast enough to offset the losses we have seen in the last 3 weeks alone. Over 140 tanks and more than 300 armored vehicles confirmed, destroyed, or captured in this single operational area. Sanctions continue to bite into the supply of microelectronics, optics, and high-precision components. What Russia is building today is increasingly a shadow of what it fielded 2 years ago: older chassis, jury-rigged armor, and crews with dwindling experience. Economically, the picture is equally grim. The secret nature of this withdrawal tells you everything about Putin's fear of domestic reaction. Russian state media is still claiming planned rotations and shortening of lines for better defense. The truth is that shortening lines in this context means giving up hard-won territory and the political narrative that accompanied it. Every kilometer surrendered is another blow to the myth of inevitable Russian victory, and the manpower crisis is compounding. Reports from inside Russia indicate that contract signing rates have plummeted even as casualty notifications continue to flood regional offices. The state is now offering ever higher bonuses and shorter contracts, but the pool of willing fighters is drying up. This brings us to the climactic turning point operation that forced the withdrawal we are seeing right now. In the final 72 hours before the collapse became undeniable, Ukrainian command executed what can only be described as a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare. They synchronized long-range precision strikes, drone swarms, and ground maneuver in a way Russian forces simply could not counter. Special reconnaissance teams infiltrated behind Russian lines, guided by drone spotters, and placed demolition charges on key bridges and supply arteries. At the same time, waves of FPV drones targeted Russian command vehicles and electronic warfare trucks. The effect was immediate and cascading. Russian units lost situational awareness, lost resupply, and lost the ability to coordinate fire support. When the main Ukrainian assault columns moved forward, they faced disorganized resistance rather than the coordinated defense Russian doctrine demanded. The hidden variable in this operation, the one mainstream analysts keep missing, is Ukrainian mastery of the observe, orient, decide, act loop at the tactical level. While Russian forces remain slaves to rigid planning and top-down orders, Ukrainian commanders at every level are empowered to exploit opportunities the moment they appear. That doctrinal flexibility turned what could have been a grinding attritional fight into a rapid breakthrough that forced the secret withdrawal. Russian commanders on the ground had no choice. Stay and be encircled, or pull back and try to establish a new line further west. They chose the latter, but the cost was everything they left behind. Let me be perfectly clear about what this means. This secret withdrawal is not an anomaly. It is the visible symptom of a larger systemic failure that has been building since the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. Russian military thinking remains trapped in the past, obsessed with mass, territory, and the belief that willpower alone can overcome technological and doctrinal inferiority. Ukrainian forces have repeatedly demonstrated the opposite. They study every Russian move, identify the weakness, and strike it with precision and speed. The result is exactly what we are seeing. Russian positions that look formidable on paper collapse under pressure that should, by every traditional metric, have been containable. History will record this moment as the point where the myth of Russian defensive resilience was finally shattered. The brutal truth Putin is hiding is that his army is no longer dictating the tempo of this war. It is reacting, retreating, and trying to hide the scale of its losses from its own population. Ukrainian adaptation has outpaced Russian rigidity at every level, tactical, operational, and now strategic. And it gets even more serious from here. The question now is not whether Ukraine can exploit this collapse. The question is how quickly and how decisively they will do so. With fresh Western-supplied systems arriving and Ukrainian production of drones scaling rapidly, the pressure on remaining Russian lines will only intensify. Moscow will be forced to make impossible choices: strip other sectors to reinforce this one, or accept further territorial losses and the political consequences that follow. This is the larger pattern confirmed once again. One side is learning and evolving in real time. The other is repeating the same doctrinal mistakes while pretending the results will somehow be different. They will not be. The Russian front line has begun to collapse in secret withdrawal. The brutal truth is now out in the open for anyone willing to see it. Ukraine is winning the adaptation race, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold. Stay with us, because what happens next in the coming days and weeks will reshape the battlefield in ways that even the most optimistic assessments have not yet fully captured. This war is not static. It is moving, and it is moving in Ukraine's favor.